What prevents a just and living wage? Sunday, November 25th, 1934. In this book entitled On Our Way, Mr. Roosevelt, our president, said, "We are not going through another winter like the last. I doubt if ever any people so bravely and cheerfully endured a season half so bitter. We cannot ask America to continue to face such needless hardships. It is time for courageous action, and the Recovery Bill gives us the means to conquer unemployment with exactly the same weapon that we have used to strike down child labor. The proposition is simply this: if all employers will act together to shorten hours and raise wages, we can put people back to work. No employer will suffer because the relative level of competitive cost will advance by the same amount for all. But if any considerable group should lag or shrink, this great opportunity will pass us by and we will go into another desperate winter. This must not happen." The quotation seems to be closely related to a recent development in our national affairs. Just last week it was decided by the United States Chamber of Commerce, which body is acting as spokesman for the industrialists and financiers of this nation, to cooperate in a more noble manner with the activities of our administration. This is a pleasant and wholesome change which is worthy of recording. Until last week, the banker and the banker-controlled industrialist spent millions of dollars obstructing the New Deal. I hope their conversion of heart is not patterned after the Greek heroes who entered the city of Troy by posing as its benefactors. Somehow or other, sagacious citizens always fear Greeks even when bearing gifts. It is not fair to interpret this gesture on the part of American business as one that is linked to subterfuge or into hypocrisy. Nor is it fair for our citizens to suspect even monetarily the motives of our president. He is endeavoring to bring about a union of forces, a union of efforts. He is not entrusting, I hope, to the hands of the old dealers the outcome of the New Deal. He is not surrendering our destinies to those who believe in the sacred right of privately manufacturing money, of expanding credit, and of contracting currency at their own wills. Above all, it would only be a vile misinterpretation to charge him with the betrayal of the interests of the American people by letting loose once more the four horsemen of the apocalypse as they mount their steeds of slavery, of famine, of pestilence, and of war. If industry and finance are determined that now it is the time to cooperate for progress and prosperity, it is honestly expected that they alter their entire philosophy which characterized their activities in the past. No longer dare they be riders of ruin and of rabid individualism. If yesterday they identified all wealth with money and all progress with gold and profits, today they must become converts to the forgotten doctrines of social justice. This nation has arrived at a point in its history where on this eve of Thanksgiving Day we can honestly return thanks to our God for having bestowed upon us the science and the mechanics of the ages, the blessings of the forest, of fields, of mines, of orchards, blessings never paralleled in the past. Besides all that, in His bounty God has filled our hearts with liberty and with a love of happiness which were never equaled in the annals of the world. For these things we are grateful, as on this day we sound the clarion call to the farmer, to laborer, and to industrialist to unite and sever, once and for all, the fetters which bind us to the slavery of finance. All these benedictions bestowed upon us by Almighty God will be useless if we permit a money policy of scarcity to dominate us in the midst of plenty. Thus, at this moment, if there is honesty of purpose in the hearts of those who formerly were so strong in their opposition, they will not be content to gauge success except in so far as they are able to place 12 million idle men at profitable work instead of exploiting the laborer. Candidly, our citizens are not in total sympathy with the American Liberty Leaguers and the fossilized Chamber of Commerce members who, in the past, openly professed their beliefs in the supremacy of property rights to the neglect of human rights. If those beliefs still predominate in the months and years to come, then I can say, go back to your plow, Mr. Farmer, and dig deep your furrows not at a profit but at a loss. Take your place on the mass production line, Mr. Laborer, at 50 or 80 cents an hour for 6 months in the year as you look forward to layoffs and breadlines. Wipe from your brow these deepening lines of worry, Mr. Merchant, and become reconciled to your disease of debt and famine of currency as you wonder how you can save your homes, pay your taxes, and retain your self-respect. If these gentlemen of industry and of finance refuse to reconcile their old policies with the new program of distribution, if they are determined to continue mumbling their meaningless incantations relative to sound money, to printing press money, to gold standardism, and to 1,000 other superstitious fears, with the hope of practicing their black arts and magic with any degree of success before our people, they are doomed to failure. It is to be hoped that we are really on our way to solving this problem of want in the midst of plenty. We must not be on our way backwards. I ask the industrialist, therefore, if he can hire one more man in his factory, if he can produce one more shoe, one more motor car, one more suit of clothes, unless the purchasing power of this country is restored, unless we revamp our financial philosophy. I further ask the industrialist, who admittedly is in business to make profits for the stockholders, if he hopes to continue with the worn-out policies of 1929 which, over a period of years, have proven to be obstacles in the path of the laborer and of the farmer. Finally, I ask the sincere bankers and manufacturers if the time has not arrived for them to put aside an economic system which was devised for production only and to adopt one which aims not only at production but also at distribution. From this day forward, industry, as represented by the United States Chamber of Commerce, must break the shackles of its obsolete theories and must recognize that a new day has dawned. If it fails to do this, I dare prophesy that before another November comes to pass, the manufacturer and the industrialist will recognize that they have been betrayed by finance. They must line up with labor and with agriculture instead of holding fast to the program of the international bankers and the money manufacturers. If we are to look to the United States Chamber of Commerce to help restore prosperity to our nation, let us investigate the record of this organization and hear what its spokesman had to say in the past. I believe that I shall be able to point out to you that its former thoughts on progress and prosperity, its former theories relative to the problem of distribution, and its former credo upon which prosperity should be built, all must be scuttled. After I point out these things to this audience with words definite and concrete from the pens and lips of the gentlemen who have pledged to lend their support to the New Deal, I challenge them either to give pronouncement to a new philosophy or else to stand by their old. If they stand by the old, honest men are forced to regard them as nothing more than mere obstructionists. In January 1932, at Decatur, Illinois, Silas H. Strawn, then president of the Chamber of Commerce, said, "Let those who are complaining of their lot here go to some other country, any other country, and see how much better off we are than the people of any other nation on earth. Let us cease to whine about depression and devote ourselves to the diligent performance of our daily duties." On that date, Mr. Strawn advocated travel and Dr. Couéism for our 12 million unemployed who were going about their duties of producing smiles on empty stomachs. In June 1932, Mr. Strawn again gave voice to the following formula for prosperity. We must balance the budget. The first step towards achieving this balanced budget should be not increased taxation, but decreased federal expenditures. The only feasible way to decrease federal expenditures is to throw to the mercies of the unkind elements the 17 million persons on our national dole. That is the way to get prosperity. Again, in July 1932, the United States Chamber of Commerce simply slays us with this platitude. We call upon the officials of our federal, state, and local governments to balance their budgets both by the elimination of all unnecessary expenditures and the increasing of such equitably levied taxes as may be necessary as an emergency measure. Just 2 years ago, the Depression could have been ended, according to these gentlemen, by increasing taxation upon the homeowners, the small businessman, the laborer, and the farmer. That was their philosophy. Finally, in July 1932, Mr. Henry I. Harriman, President of the United States Chamber of Commerce, issued his magnanimous 14-point program for recovery. Here it is synopsized. 1. The budget must be balanced by raising more taxes. 2. The President of the United States should be given power to veto or to reduce appropriation bills of Congress. 3. The Federal Reserve banks must have control over credit. 4. Amend the antitrust laws. 5. Enlarge the power of trade associations. 6. Let business establish its own economic councils free from government interference. 7. Repeal that portion of the Farm Board Act which authorizes the attempt to equalize prices by government purchases. 8. Reduce the hours of labor. Nothing is said about increasing the pay of labor. 9. Keep the Reconstruction Finance Corporation loaning to private and public works. 10. Amend the Volstead Act. Do not repeal it. 11. Refers to our ex-soldiers. Let the government give care to the dependents of those who lost their lives, but the name veteran must not be sullied by its use as a cloak to cover the demands for pensions, bonus, or hospitalization. 12. give the president the power of a dictator, of a Mussolini, so that when Congress is not in session, he can suspend the operation of existing laws and provide emergency measures required by the public welfare. 13. Keep out of the League of Nations, but enter into the World Court. 14. The Depression of 1929 was caused by a loss of moral perspective and a collapse of common honesty. The Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments will always be the true guide to real and lasting prosperity. These, my friends, are the 14 points in a program for the restoration of prosperity. They were published by Mr. Harriman, the present President of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Pleasant news to the ears of the farmer, the labor, the veteran, and the democracy-loving American. No suggestion for a living wage, no conception for agricultural profits, no intimation of restoring to Congress the right to coin and regulate the value of money, no plan to produce except for a profit, no relief to the taxpayer, no program for removing the causes of depression. In fact, no depression, but simply a collapse of honesty. Does the United States Chamber of Commerce seriously regard the collapse of honesty on the part of bankers and brokers, of bogus bond salesmen and hideout holding companies? Does it wish to protect the depositors' money? In May 1933, the United States Chamber of Commerce went on to record in favor of the bankers and against the depositors when it said, "The Chamber is specifically against government guarantee of deposits. The Chamber of Commerce recommends the federal and state governments enact laws permitting, under careful regulation, the extension of branch banking." This, my friends, is the Bourbonism, the laissez-faireism, the do-as-you-pleaseism of which I spoke last Sunday. This is the philosophy of the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is demanding that the death sentence be passed upon the National Recovery Act, and contends that, while unions among working men are permissible, that industrialists need pay no attention to the demands of the union. In January 1934, Mr. Harriman, President of the United States Chamber of Commerce, wrote an article in a magazine known as The Nation's Business, which he titled, "Faith in Money is Essential." Although every child in this nation knows that we are suffering from a lack of money and from an unbearable burden of debt money, Mr. Harriman propounded this financial program. 1. Promptly establish a fixed gold standard, revaluing the gold dollar if necessary. 2. Stabilize our currency of Great Britain through the medium of our privately owned Federal Bank and the privately owned Central Banks of England. 3. Change the legislation for the so-called permanent plan for insurance of bank deposits. 4. Remove all burdens which the National Recovery Act is now placing upon small business. This, then, is the skeleton of a program totally opposed to the program for which we stand. It is the avowed proposal on the part of the United States Chamber of Commerce to keep us tied to the privately owned central banks and to permit these privately owned central banks to continue with our famine of money and the regulation of our currency. Again I challenge the United States Chamber of Commerce to scuttle this philosophy, or their silence will force us to conclude that they still cling to it and are, therefore, nothing more than Greeks bearing gifts into the city which they would destroy. All these charges and statements, which I made relative to the United States Chamber of Commerce, have been written or subscribed to by spokesmen for this organization in the volumes of its publication known as The Nation's Business. My friends, now you know the new deal that this body proposes to give you if it retains the philosophy so clearly expressed by its spokesman during the past 2 years. You know its avowed opposition to financial reform and its hostility to industrial and agricultural reform. Between the lines, it is easy for you to read that it is still wedded to its belief in production for a profit, and profit only. Here is one lobby which, apparently, has succeeded in expressing its views. However, I ask you if there is enough red blood left in the American people, including the industrialists, to protest against these policies which are detrimental to our interests, to our happiness, and to our rights as American citizens, to decent livelihood, not one of which rights can be obtained if the philosophy of the United States Chamber of Commerce is reduced to practice. The challenge still holds good. I have no personal quarrel with any of the members of the United States Chamber of Commerce, but steadfastly I shall quarrel with their philosophy as long as they retain it. Unfortunately, they have been educated in a school that knew little and cared less for the practical interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. It was the same school which protected slavery, the same school which often identified virtue with the cunning squeezing through loopholes of conscience which led to the practices of mass exploitation. Keenly apprehensive, flawlessly organized, they worked in silence, always careful to avoid a display of their power or an exhibition of their plans. But now you know their plans. Today, with their backs against the tottering wall of the old deal, they must accept the challenge either to help produce prosperity or to cease opposing any and all policies which aim to make of the Sermon of the Mount a practical norm of life instead of a platitude to be played with. The new philosophy of social justice I shall defend against their exaggerated interpretation of property rights. I shall oppose their old theories of financial bondage as long as it is my privilege to utilize the facilities of this radio. While discussing the man-made poverty which has been inflicted upon the people of the United States by reason of such philosophy as was formerly advocated by the United States Chamber of Commerce, let me forewarn these gentlemen that their old sophistry of supply and demand is no safe rule in economics today or tomorrow. There is the most plenteous supply that has ever existed in this nation, and, at the same time, the greatest demand which ever existed in this world. There is simply a lack of money for the supply to reach the demand. According to Circular 296 of the United States Department of Agriculture, the same department which supports the policy of destruction, I am sorry to say, we have made the following facts to substantiate the statement I just made. there is disclosed an annual deficiency of approximately 27 billion pounds of milk, or 13 billion quarts, a deficiency of 1 to 1.33 billion pounds of tomatoes and citrus fruits, a deficiency of more than 12 billion pounds of fruits and green vegetables, a deficiency of 2 billion pounds of meat, a shortage of more than 13 billion eggs, and 2.5 billion pounds of sugar. These deficiencies and shortages do not exist because there is not a supply or because there is not a demand, but simply because the people who want to use the supply have not the money to buy it. We have millions of untilled acres which could be devoted to the raising of cattle and to the supplying of milk, of fruits, and of vegetables, and yet our farmers are forced to forego their agricultural pursuits because the philosophy of scarce money has ordained that they operate at a loss. If 527 million acres and 6 million American farmers are partially idle to fail to meet the adequate food requirements of our people to the astonishing extent that nearly 100 billions of pounds of foodstuffs, it is not logical to say that there is an undersupply or an overdemand. Were these acres and these farmers permitted to work under a decent financial system, there would be no need of importing foodstuffs and no undersupply in actual products. We have a superabundance of potential supply and an equal demand for foodstuffs. The people of this nation know this. All the sophistry that you can preach will be nothing more than buncombe in the future. While we are slaughtering cattle, burning wheat, and plowing under cotton, we have imported 22 billion pounds of foodstuffs at prices cheaper than our farmers could afford to produce. How can the United States Chamber of Commerce and the so-called sound money advocates face these facts of want in the midst of plenty, or want created by their modern financial system? As for a demand or a supply of wearing apparel, in the prosperous year of 1929, not to mention the depression year of 1934, the men of this nation were supplied on a per capita basis of a bare 1/3 of a garment of new outwear. In other words, in this land of plenty, where 2 new suits of clothes per year might be reasonably expected by each man, there was deficiency of some 66 million suits of clothes. And this in a country where our American ability to produce could supply 2 suits for each man. For the female population, which fared much better, there was barely 1/2 garment, including skirts, ensembles, and suits. On a minimum living standard basis of 2 new outer garments for each woman in this country, the deficiency was in excess of 52 million garments. This had nothing to do either with supply or demand. The deficiency is totally related to the lack of purchasing power, to a famine of money. If you care to express the same thought in another manner, all this lack of clothing and this undernourishment were due to the damnable philosophy of production for profit instead of profitable use. I repeat that we had both the acreage and the mechanical capacity to supply 2 full garments to each and every individual, which would increase our cotton and wool production by 5 billion pounds. This means an increase of 6 times our present number of sheep and additional 17 million acres of cotton in cultivation if our farmers were allowed to operate for profitable use and if our factories were allowed to keep open and supply the necessary clothing required by our people. What does the United States Chamber of Commerce think when confronted by these facts placed alongside their philosophy? Are they under the impression that our laborers in the factory and our farmers on the soil will continue to produce only for the benefit and the profit of the stockholders and the bankers who control our industries and, through their mortgages, control our farms? Shall we go on forever with rules and regulations invented for an economy of scarcity, when today we are confronted with an economy of abundance? Of our 527 million acres of workable land, only 280 millions are devoted to the production of food. If our 125 million people in this nation were eating a decent American diet, we would have need of 335 million acres of production. Yet we purposefully attempt to commit the sacrilege of less and lessism by clinging to the falsities of scarce money when God has blessed us with the abundance of more and moreism. No wonder that the scriptures remind us that money is the root of all evil. A plenitude is within our very grasp, but the acquisition of it is obstructed because the United States Chamber of Commerce's philosophy of production for profit and not for human needs is again in the saddle. Meantime, you will starve. You will clothe yourselves just on this side of nakedness, because those who control money pervert the law of supply and demand. God's law of justice and of charity, I am afraid, has become outmoded, and in its stead, man's law of greed reigns supreme. The international bankers, the privately owned Federal Reserve bankers, the industrialists who continue to subscribe to the philosophy of profit for stockholders at any price and production for profit only, certainly are not only refusing to face the facts of modern existence, they are refusing to face and recognize the very principles which relate to their own self-preservation. Last Sunday, I partly developed for you the second point in the program of the National Union for Social Justice relative to a decent living annual wage. In connection with this, I pointed out that one of the chief functions of our government is to supply opportunities for work for those who are willing and able to work. I intimated that a scale of wages based only on payment while you work and breadlines while you don't work is one of the first causes for unemployment and is contrary to social justice. Today may I emphasize 3 more principles which must be adopted before a living and fair wage can be secured. 1. There is demanded of the workingmen, of the industrialists, and of the farmers of this nation a union of effort and goodwill, to the end that a scale of wages will be set up which will enable the greatest number of our citizens to secure the greatest opportunities to purchase the necessities and conveniences of modern American life. This is the first principle. 2. Besides advocating a union between the laborer, the farmer, and the industrialist, I might add this further principle that a reasonable relation between the prices obtained for the products of the farm and the wages paid for the products of labor must be established, if there will be such a thing as a just wage. Call this the commodity dollar if you will. But we must work towards this end, namely that we shall not be deprived of our goods, which the wealth and the resources of nature, of our scientists and of our factories, supply us because of a scarcity of dollars or because of our dear dollars. Money must no longer be our master and we its slaves. The supply of money and the regulated value of money must be in proportion to the supply of nature's products and to human demands. It is not Christianity to teach that men and women are supposed to live in poverty. Poverty is the breeder of holdups, brigandry, immorality, and vice. Prosperity and culture, provided they be used with prudence, are singular helps to virtue. That is our teaching. 3. I contend that it is impossible to have a just and living wage or an equitable price level established for the commodities of the farm or of the factory under the system of modern capitalism. I am practical enough to forget the dictionary definition of capitalism and to accept its definition as translated by the actual facts which today are identified with capitalism. I take this stand against capitalism for the following reasons. A. Modern capitalism violates the right order because it employs the working of wage-earning classes as to divert business and economic activity to its own advantage without any regard to the human dignity of the workers, the social character of economic life, social justice, and the common good. B. It is evident in our days that capitalism not only accumulates wealth, but also immense power and despotic economic domination into the hands of a few, and those few are frequently not the owners, but only the trustees and directors of invested funds that administer these funds at their own good pleasure. It is absolutely erroneous to say that the public utility corporations, for example, are owned by hundreds of thousands of stockholders, that a steel corporation possesses 500,000 owners and General Motors 300,000 owners. As a matter of fact, most of the stock in public utilities in the steel industry and the motor industry is controlled by a very small group of men, and these in turn by 3 other men, Mellon, Morgan, and DuPont, whose representatives outvote the hundreds of thousands of so-called stockholders. C. This capitalistic power has become particularly irresistible because it has been exercised by those who held and controlled money and who governed and determined the allotment of credit. For that reason, upon bended knee, industry and labor and agriculture were forced in the past to beg from them for the supply of the lifeblood, so to speak, to the entire economic body. The financiers grasp, as it were, in their hands the very soul of production, so that no one dares breathe, let alone live, against their will. D. Free competition is a further characteristic note of modern capitalism. This permits the survival only of those who are the strongest, and means that those who fight the most relentlessly, careless of the commandments and of social justice, are the victors to whom belong the spoils. E. Modern capitalism, as suggested by Mr. Harriman, whom I quoted to you, has always been identified with the dictatorship of economic domination. It was chiefly due to this phase of modern capitalism that fierce battles arose to acquire control of the nation so that its resources of power, of light, of water, and of money, as well as the House of Representatives, could be abused in the struggle for existence. It was this same economic dictatorship which could not brook a rival, for by its very nature it created wars amongst the nations. F. This well-known characteristic of modern capitalism is one of unbridled ambition for domination, which has succeeded the desire for profits. As a result, the whole economic life has become hard, cruel, and relentless in a ghastly measure. Furthermore, the multiplication of federal and state officers, the intermingling and scandalous confusion of duties and offices of civil authority have been created under capitalism to protect the privileged classes. No wonder our government sometimes is regarded as a slave who, if he attempts to rebel against this economic system of capitalism, is confronted with capital on strike and is forced to kiss the hand of the banker who holds the lash. Gee, from modern capitalism, as from a poisoned fountainhead, there flows that stream of detestable internationalism by which the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, and the Morgans dominate affairs not only in America, but also in the central banks of Europe, and fly from their mastheads the flag which bears this emblem, "My country, 'tis where my fortune is." It is an internationalism which cares not for the righteousness of social justice or of sound philosophy, but is willing, or the protection of its private property, to become a bedfellow with the harlot of the ages. This was done by capitalistic France, who, the day before yesterday, wedded her destinies to those of communistic Russia. These 7 statements are associated with the second principle in our platform for social justice. These are the 7 obstacles that prevent a just and living wage, and these are the obstacles that must be removed. It is impossible for the laborer, for the farmer, or for the honest industrialist to presume that there is such a thing as a just wage or purchasing power in this nation when all profits are siphoned into the hands of a few. It is presumptuous to discuss questions relative to a just and honest wage as long as the working people of America support the system of modern capitalism that is not one whit better than Russian communism. If I advocate its dissolution, I come to you people to teach you the philosophy of social justice. The testing hour has arrived. The challenge has gone out to the bankers and to the industrialists who supported modern capitalism less than 2 weeks ago to forget their philosophy and to line up with God's philosophy. Every plank in the platform for social justice is founded upon the commandments, on the scriptures, and upon the dignity of God's fatherhood and man's brotherhood. My friends, there was a time when I was peacefully reconciled to privation and want, to the existence of undernourished children, barefoot men and broken-hearted women, caught as I was in the whirlpool of a hideous philosophy of money, which I had accepted as something inevitable like sunrise and sunset. I dared preach patience to my people, when the only patience that should have been in their hearts was tolerance for me, who was a blind leader leading the blind. But those days of defending modern capitalism have gone. I have dared to reject that philosophy of finance which breeds unnecessary poverty, which generates tubercular children and universal misery.